Hello everyone, this is part 2 of my reading list. Just a disclaimer, this is for fair use and this is for educational purposes and for those who cannot do that. So my particular thing I want to do here is see that this is chapter 2. What is disability? Definitions and terminology. For most people familiar with the term, disability refers, in Western societies, to limitations in an individual's mental or physical functions. Disabled people themselves, however, disagree on what exactly disability refers to. People themselves, however, the first area of difficulty concerns impairment itself. The term disability applies to people with a diverse range of impairments, the majority of which are invisible to others. Second, many people who meet the legal definition of disability do not define themselves as disabled, although others with an identical impairment may well do so. A third complication is that some impairments fluctuate or become progressively more incapacitating, while others, which are more constant in their effects, vary in levels of their severity. There are nonetheless compelling political reasons for preferring particular terms, for instance, disabled person or persons with a disability, rather than older terms such as handicapped, or particularly in the US, retarded, is largely due to campaigns by disabled people and their supporters that both of the latter came to be seen as offensive and associated with helplessness or inferior human status. This led the UK charity The Spastic Society, for example, to change its name to Scope in 1995. Any serious discussion of the history and politics of disability requires, as a starting point, a clear and constant approach to definitions and terminology. The use of particular terms can advance or undermine understanding, depending on the specific historical context. Those who believe disability has always existed, for example, apply the term uncritically to societies and historical records where the term or concept was unknown. This approach is fundamentally mistaken. Even today, the majority of the world population living in the global south may refer to blind or slow people or those with walking difficulties, but have no general term equivalent to disability or disabled people in their language or culture. The most important issue concerning definitions is the way in which modern society constantly conflates or confuses the distinct concepts of impairment and disability, often treating them as interchangeable terms. In order to fully address this, we need to begin by asking how disability is defined in the relevant existing legislation. Official definitions of disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 states the term disability means, with respect to an individual, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of major life activities of the individual. B, a record of such an impairment, or C, being regarded as having an impairment. The UK Equality Act 2010 takes a slightly different approach, defining disability as a long-term impairment which has significant adverse effect on his or her ability to carry out day-to-day functions. Both legal definitions embody a contradiction. Disability is defined in individual and medical terms, in other words, as the property of the individual, but is simultaneously treated as equivalent to other forms of discrimination. This confusion over terminology is not new. In 2006, an article in the medical journal The Lancet attempted to grapple with an earlier definition. Quote, "The current draft of the UN Convention does not define disability, but rather peoples with disabilities. Unfortunately, this definition fails to acknowledge that disability is an essential health issue that plays out in all areas of individual and social life. The definition of the Convention of People with Disabilities is solely medical and restricts the concept of disability to only those with long-term impairments, irrespective of their level of participation. Proposed replacement, disability is a difficulty in functioning at the body, person, or societal levels in one or more life domains as experienced by an individual with a health condition in interaction with contextual factors." The World Health Organization's definition makes it a clear distinction between the terms. Disabilities is an umbrella term covering impairments, activity limitations, participation restrictions. An impairment is a problem in body, function, or structure. An activity limitation is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or action, while a participation restriction is a problem experienced by an individual in involvement in life situations. Thus, disability is a complex phenomenon, reflecting an interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he and she lives. End quote. Well, in Britain, disability has recently become strongly associated with incapacity and benefits dependency, or welfare for you Americans. On the eve of the London 2012 Games, Paralympics Committee President Philip Craven, himself a wheelchair user, went so far as to argue that the word disabled should be dropped from all media coverage altogether. As he put it, how could these athletes be viewed as anything other than able? These examples demand some political and historical context. On the one hand, they reflect the social progress made by disabled people since they were referred to officially as spastic, imbeciles, or worse. However, they obscure the vital distinction established by the disability movement between individual impairment, the condition in other words, and body-brain difference, as I like to call it, and disability as social discrimination. The social model of disability. The nature and heterogeneity of impairment is one aspect of disability which distinguishes it from other forms of oppression. Impairments may be physical or mental, or both, single or multiple, temporary or permanent, and acquired before or after birth. Most are hidden or invisible, but many may be severe disfiguring or incapacitating, painful or even terminal. As Tom Shakespeare observes in Disability Rights and Wrongs, the limitations which individual bodies or minds impose vary from trivial to profound. The majority of disabled people who do not have stable congenital impairments or sudden traumatic lesions such as spinal cord injury, but instead have rheumatism or cardiovascular disease or other chronic degenerative conditions associated with aging. End quote. Most people don't fit into neat binary categories of disabled on one hand and non-disabled on the other. People with slight visual hearing deficits can render these almost irrelevant in the use of spectacles and or hearing aids, although these may not be free. Those defined as blind or deaf, however, face far greater obstacles to social integration. In addition, people with the most severe impairments may be highly dependent on support provided by others, such as the 6 million carers in the UK alone. A related problem is that disabled people constantly fear that they may become associated with those that they see as less employable and more dependent. By trying to distance themselves from groups that see as more disabled than themselves, they can hope to maintain their claim to economic independence and an acceptable status within the community, end quote. One recent British study showed that, quote, both disabled and non-disabled people regard those with learning disability or mental illness as the least desirable groups. Well, that's me fucked then. According to government research, a large majority of disabled people, in the UK at least, do not actually consider themselves to be disabled. Deaf people pose a particular problem in these terms. Many whose first language is sign see themselves as a linguistic minority, that means a language minority, and regard integration as a threat to a history and culture which lasted 250 years. A final consideration here is that by far the greatest proportion of impairments are acquired during an individual's lifetime rather than at birth, most commonly as a result of disease, injury, or some other trauma. The sudden change involved can be immensely challenging. It may even trigger a wholesale reassessment of one's life, priorities, and practical perspective. For example, Vic Wallenstein and Mike Oliver, who became leading figures in the disability movement, were both paralysed from the neck down after accidents they had as young adults. All this points to the importance of the pioneering distinction between impairment and disability. This was first made explicit by a tiny group of disabled socialists in 1975. The Union for the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, UPIAS, declared that disability, far from being biologically determined, was a social creation and as such could be challenged and eliminated. Quote, in our view, it is society which disabled physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments. By the way, we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. Thus we define impairment as the lacking all or part of limb, organ or mechanism of the body. And disability is a disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by a contemporary social organisation which takes little or no account of people who have physical impairments and thus excludes them from the mainstream of social activities. End quote. These fundamental principles form the basis of what we became known as the social model of disability. As Mike Oliver put it, quote, if disability is seen as a tragedy, then disabled people will be treated as if they are victims of some tragic happening or substance. This treatment will be translated into social policies which will attempt to compensate these victims for the tragedies that have befallen them. If disability is defined as social oppression, which I believe it is, myself, then disabled people will be seen as a collective victims of an uncaring or unknowing society. Such a view will be translated into social policies geared towards alleviating oppression rather than compensating individuals. End quote. The social model of disability, discussed in more detail in the next chapter, because it became hugely influential. Partly in the UK, particularly in the UK, it helped shape the disability movement of the late 1980s and 1990s. Was key to the foundation of the academic field of disability studies and informed, albeit to a limited degree, the subsequent anti-discrimination legislation. This fundamental distinction between disability and impairment informs the approach taken throughout this book. How many disabled people are there? Global estimates of impairment. Defining disability is not only a matter of policy, more fundamental, at least, to those who run and control the economy is the issue of numbers and therefore of costs. The Economist, Britain's leading business magazine, recently articulated these concerns. Quote, measuring pain and misery is hard. Over 1 billion people, 1 in 7, have some kind of disability according to the World Health Organization. But that may be on the high side. American Census Bureau, which has been counting the disabled since 1830, found 57 million in a survey of economic status in 2012. That was nearly 1 in 5, of whom half said their disability was severe. A national housing survey counted a mere 22 million, whereas a health survey tallied 62 million. Ireland's 2006 census found a disability rate of 9.3%. The 2001 round also asked about pain and breathing troubles. It reported a rate 40% higher. Some count dyslexia and autism as a disability. Others, including many of these conditions, face a contest that they see as a negative label. The effect of a disability also depends on what means are available to cope with it. Our survey in Zambia found that more than 4 out of 5 disabled people lack the devices and aids they needed. What may be a nuisance in a rich country can truly be crippling in a poor country. This makes it hard to decide the threshold at which the disadvantage or woe merits recognition or special treatment. End quote. Such worries are widely shared among the world's rulers. The proportion of disabled people rose from an estimated 10% of the global population in the 1970s to 15% in 2011. Due mainly to an aging population and rise of chronic health conditions such as cardiovascular disease and respiratory diseases, heart and lung issues. The same World Health Organization report concludes that disabled people remain second-class citizens, with 1 in 5 experiencing significant difficulties. In advanced economies of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, countries, disabled people are 3 times more likely to be denied health care than other people, and disabled children are less likely to start or stay in school. In the OECD countries, the comparative employment rates of disabled and non-disabled people were 44% and 75% for disabled people respectively. 44% employment rate for disabled people and a 75% employment rate for non-disabled people. The World Health Organization report identified barriers such as discrimination, inadequate health care and rehabilitation services, and inaccessible transport, buildings and information. Higher living costs, for example, transportation, support services and assistive technology, we don't know, that's like screen readers and the like, also means that disabled people have a 50% greater risk of incurring catastrophic health costs, so high that it pushes them under the poverty line. The WHO survey conducted across 51 countries gives employment rates of just 52.8% for men with a disability and 19.6% for women with a disability, compared with 64.9% for non-disabled men and 29.9% for non-disabled women. It also found that individuals with mental health difficulties or intellectual impairments experienced the lowest employment rates and are more likely to be employed in segregated settings. In the countries of the Global South, the picture is even worse. According to the 2011 WHO survey, 20% of the world's poorest people are disabled, with nearly 80% living in low-income countries. Figures from the World Bank in 2009 showed that in Latin America and the Caribbean, LAC, the incurrence of impairment, quote, is especially high in post-conflict countries, in areas of natural disasters. And about 80 to 90% of disabled people in LAC are unemployed or outside the workforce. Most of those who have jobs receive little or no pay. For example, in Argentina, the unemployment rate for disabled people is estimated to be close to 91%. In countries for which the data is available, less than 20% of disabled people receive insurance benefits. End quote. Leaving aside its terminology for a moment, an earlier 2008 World Health Organization report provides a picture of the most common causes of impairment globally. Quote, hearing loss, vision problems, and mental disorders are the most common causes of disability. A significant portion of disabilities are caused by traffic crashes, falls, burns, and acts of violence such as child abuse, youth violence, intimate partner violence, and more. Up to 1/4 of disabilities may result from injuries and violence. These include physical and or cognitive limitations due to neurotrauma, which is head trauma during getting physically attacked, paralysis due to spinal cord trauma, partial or complete amputation of limbs, physical deformation resulting in mobility impairments, and psychological trauma, sensory disability such as blindness and deafness. End quote. The WHO's 2008 report also highlights mental disorders as among the leading 20 causes of disability worldwide, with depression alone affecting around 120 million people. Fewer than 25% of those affected have access to adequate treatment and healthcare. These statistics prove three things above all. Firstly, a large proportion of the world's population are disabled. Secondly, many of their impairments are socially caused. And thirdly, a large majority of disabled people are poor. Words as weapons. The Economist article quoted above points to the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, calls disability an evolving concept. And also the US, those labelled as imbeciles and defectives were segregated and sterilised until the 1960s. It could be added that homosexuality was listed in the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, as a psychiatric disorder until 1973. Sometimes differences in terms are merely just that. For example, paralysis of the legs and some trunk muscles is known in the UK as paraplegia. In the US, it's called quadriplegia. But while this may be true for many medical terms, in other fields the language used is revealing. The word idiot, for example, was once a legal term to describe someone with a mental impairment and featured in the 1901 UK census. The UK's electoral admission bill was amended only in May 2006, abolishing rules stipulating that idiots could not vote and that lunatics could do so only during the lucid intervals. Laws using these terms date back to the 17th century, but most have been replaced or repealed in the last 40 years or so. The US Congress replaced the term mental retardation with intellectual disabilities as recently as 2010. Few complained about political correctness when the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was replaced in 1990 by the Individuals with Disability Education Act. Matters are not always so straightforward. One writer recently discussed the difficulties in using appropriate terminology in the area of mental health. Quote, I used the term service users because I wanted to avoid imposing a label on people. I didn't want to use the term mentally ill because I know there are plenty of people using mental health services who do not consider themselves to be mentally ill. Referring to people with mental health problems or difficulties or issues also leaves me slightly uneasy because it seems to me to draw a line where I do not believe one exists. Patients, clients, and consumers all have slightly Orwellian ring, especially when referring to clients being detained against their will, but language is also what links individuals, however precarious the bridge, we have to keep striving to cross it. End quote. The problem with the term service user, of course, is that it excludes anyone who does not use mental health services. In the UK, school pupils diagnosed with specific learning difficulties such as dyslexia are commonly described as having special needs, but this term is never used in higher education where it is correctly, in my view, considered an anachronism. It means something from the past. One other example will suffice to illustrate the complexity of this area. The word handicap is largely no longer used, partly due to the widespread belief that its origins derive from begging as a cap in hand. In fact, the term was first used in the Middle Ages and it refers to games or sport. Quote, the 17th century diarist Samuel Pepys enjoyed a game of handicap. The word handicap, in connection to people with impairments, can only be traced back to the beginnings of the 20th century, and then derive from the sense of disadvantage, and the sense of inequalities of race or gender, in horse racing and in golf, and even then it has no historical association with begging. End quote. It is, however, the meaning commonly associated with words that matter most. The term handicapped became so strongly associated with charity and paternalistic attitudes to disabled people that its real origins became irrelevant. The term disability, in contrast, understood as referring to discrimination against people with mental and physical impairments, became a political expression of fight for rights. Wankers. The situation today could be described as a free market civil rights. In 2010, the UK coalition government launched an historic assault on the NHS by stating that its guiding principle was no decision about me without me. A clear reference to the famous slogan of the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. Politicians have become adept at turning rebellion into money. In this case, using the language of disability rights to further their removal in practice. Most of us would prefer genuine support from people unfamiliar with the right terminology to burlesque, dismissive, or plain insulting attitudes from someone careful to use the correct language. There is a qualitative difference between someone using the term confined to a wheelchair while supporting equal access to transport and a coach company which trained its staff in the use of more acceptable terms such as wheelchair user, or still refusing to provide accessible vehicles on cost grounds. What is true for individuals, in other words, applies far greater degree to the actions of governments and big business. Use of terms in the book. All this is, of course, a political argument, and language in itself a political battleground. This book uses the term disabled people rather than people with disabilities. The latter term, occasionally used in Britain, is that used in the US in favour of the US disability movement. Both terms have much to commend them in comparison to their predecessors, but there is good reason for the preference. People with disabilities is sometimes described as people first term because it starts with the fact that a person with an impairment is first and foremost a human being, as opposed to an object of pity or charity. However, it still implies that disability is a property of the person. Disabled people is the term campaigned for and popularised by the UK disability movement. It refers to disadvantage, inequality, and discrimination primarily as a social phenomenon, something caused by society rather than directly arising from each individual's impairment. If it is possible to show that people are disabled by society, not by their impairments, then a society that treats impairment differently must also be possible. Others argue that we should use the term differently abled to refer in preference to disabled. This approach confuses acceptable language with social context, as if the issue of discrimination could be simply wished away or ignored altogether. In a similar vein, this book avoids using the term specific learning differences. The case of deaf people is slightly different. The use of the capital D signifies membership of and identifying with a community whose preferred and sole form of communication in place of speech is sign language, and who perceive themselves to have shared history and culture. Although this book discusses some of the differences of such an approach, it uses the term the capital B, D, because this is the format preferred by most deaf people. Mental health is a more complex area where meanings and labels are even more contested, including in respect of mental illness themselves. As the British Psychological Society puts it, seeing experiences as symptoms of illness is only one way of seeing them, and one that not everyone finds helpful. End quote. People who experience mental health difficulties are often called patients or sufferers, although they may not see themselves as being ill, like myself. Well, kind of. This book unavoidably uses specific diagnostic terms while recognizing that these are controversial and contested. Terms such as patient, disorder, or condition are therefore used here only in appropriate context. Even more neutral formulation service users ignore the very large numbers of people with mental health difficulties who never use mental health services. At the least value-laden term available, I have therefore opted to use the term mental distress, even if it may seem too trivial to cover the most serious categories of mental ill health. The final issue here concerns tautology. This book argues not only that disability is a distinct form of oppression, but also that this social understanding of disability is little known or partially understood. I have therefore at various points felt the need to add discrimination after the word disability in order to ensure this meaning is clearly conveyed. The contradiction here is one that exists in society, which is why the real meaning of this very capitalist condition will remain contested until that reality itself is altered. End of chapter. This is an excellent chapter for me and many others, and please go and re-listen to some parts of it, because there's quite a lot thrown at you. This is when you go and look at going forward as disability as a form of social oppression and its roots seen in society, social structures, and value systems. For me, I already had inklings of this due to neurodiversity and seeing a neurodiversity paradigm. But after reading this book in 2018, I began to realise that my instinct was far truer than I possibly could have realised. The social moral disability and the act of I am not broken but society is broken made me more and more radicalised until this very day. The more I read and more books and my personal experience dealing with the society and world around me and political and social institutions that are either ignorant or willfully ignorant of this particular stream of consciousness and straight and understanding of disabled people as oppressed rather than a medical tragedy as briefly mentioned. You understand, this is the most empowering thing for disabled people to realise that they themselves are not the sole lotus of the problem, individuating it in the neoliberal and capitalist society as a you problem rather than a we problem, an our problem within society. If you can even understand the liberation that is to have not just a term, the social moral disability, but a social and political framework to fight back against that and to recognise it for what it really is. Social discrimination and oppression, and even it ends up with death and a whole host of others, horrors and violence done to disabled people. I hope there's a lot of food for thought, and I will be continuing this, and I should be, hopefully, fingers crossed, finished it by the end of December, if not a little bit into January. I hope you've enjoyed this one. And I'll see. I should wash my hair. And I hope you're having a good day. And it's food for thought. And hopefully begins to get slowly and but surely a foundation to have an analysis. But also begin to see why you get angry, frustrated, and alienated by mainstream social and economic activists on the left are not understanding this basic understanding principles discussed in this chapter and future chapters. And on that note, I'll talk to you later, and there'll be also going to be other playlists on other books such as No Contest by Judy Hunt and others. This is not going to be the last, and also I'm going to have ones on specific PDFs and essays on disability. So please watch out for that. And the PDFs for those, I believe, are readily available, will be in the description below, as always. And as always, nothing about us without us. And there's no shame in being less exploitable.